Well, thank you all for sticking it out since 8:30 this morning, and it's been a Herculean feat. But I think this is a real opportunity now to hear from Jim Wolfensohn, who was my boss at the World Bank from 1997 to 2000, but he actually served at the World Bank from 1995 to 2005. He's now chairman of Wolfensohn and Company, and has been, we thought it was really appropriate for him to speak to this group, because the World Bank is a social responsible investor. And you shouldn't laugh, it's actually true. And it shows that one can invest money and get have an impact on development, on education, on issues of global concern like global warming, poverty, and we this afternoon heard from one branch of the World Bank, which was the IFC, which has actually been, as it was pointed out, having a program to try to bring in sovereign wealth funds into their programs. I suppose I should add one more thing, and on top of his roles in the World Bank, and let me say also that he really transformed the World Bank in that decade, because the World Bank before that had been to a large extent a bank, and didn't realize as fully as it should the social impact that an institution like the World Bank could have. And in his first trip after he became the president of the World Bank, he went around Africa, and I think it was both a very telling experience for him, but also one, it was symbolic of the role that the World Bank could play. But I should also mention that at age 40, Jim took up the cello, and 10 years later, he performed at Carnegie Hall. And this is just a continuation of an amazing set of talents, including serving on the Olympic fencing team for Australia. And so it's a kind of virtuoso that, okay.
I wrote the introduction for Joe, and I was getting a little worried that he'd left out so much that I wanted to do it myself. Joe is always very kind to me. He invites me when you've all been sitting since 8:30 this morning, hearing one lecture after the other, and then says, I'd like you to give a 45-minute lecture on the international financial situation, and you'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to do that. And that what I want to try and do is to get across a few points and then sit down and let you all go home so that you get ready for Al Gore tomorrow morning, who will talk to you about the environment. I was interested in talking to you about the environment, but Al, I think, would be very upset if I stole his line. So I'm going to talk about something else, but to frame it just briefly, I wanted to remind you that things have changed a lot in terms of the issue of poverty and the issue of the number of people on our planet and how we're structured. For the years just before 2000, we had a period of stability in which the OECD countries were typically 80% of the global GDP, with 1 billion people. and 5 billion people had 20% of the global GDP. And that was true more or less for 30 years. And then things started to change at the end of the last century and in the first decade of this, and now we've seen that the population's grown by another 600-700 million people, but that the population of the so-called rich world is grown and will grow between now and 2050 only from 1 billion to maybe 1.1 billion. And the 5 billion in the developing world will in fact become close to 8 billion. Those are the raw numbers that you have. But the other drama is, of course, that two other things are happening. The traditional dominance of the United States and Europe and Japan is now significantly changing. And as this group well knows, because so many of you are in the business, we're seeing that by 2050, it is likely that China and India together, and I see my friends from CIC here, China and India together will have of the order of 45 to 50% of the global GDP, and that Asia will have of the order of 65% of the global GDP. This last happened in 1815 and before that in 1500. But what a dramatic change it is, because after World War II, China and India were less than 2% of the global GDP. So we're seeing a change of just remarkable proportions. And I'm sure that all of you know that what this is doing for the accumulation of funds in the sovereign wealth funds, and also the opportunities for investment, notably in Asia, but not limited to Asia. And you know something of what is happening in the United States and in Europe as they, at the moment, are becoming less competitive and certainly, while not unimportant, certainly relatively less important. But the thing that I'm really concerned about and want to raise while you're in weakened condition is that there is something else that is happening. And that is that Africa, which is little talked about, and as I understand it, has been very little talked about today at this meeting, is a continent of 53 countries. It has of the order of 800 to 900 million people living in there. And that by the year 2050, the continent will have grown to somewhere around 1.8 billion of a then global population of 9 billion. It will be of the order of 20% of the global GDP. 20% of the global population. And it will be less than 2% of the global GDP. Now, this is not any longer the Africa that I knew 50 years ago. It's no longer an unconnected Africa. It's no longer an Africa that you think of in terms of doing safaris and lions and tigers and all the things that in the books we learned about. This is an Africa that is very different. But it's different in a number of ways. It's different in that it does not have sufficient funds for development. It does not have, in all cases, the appropriate leadership for development. But it is also something that no fund, no country that is better off can ignore. This is not a responsibility that we can just say has nothing to do with us. We cannot not think of 2 billion people on a planet of 9 billion. They're not unconnected. It is a massive group of people. And we spend too little time thinking about it. And what I was hoping that if I had one thought tonight that I could leave you with, it is that sovereign wealth funds should maybe respond to the idea of my successor but one, Bob Zellick, and think in terms of having 1% of the funds allocated for Africa. Throwing money away in Africa is not what I'm suggesting. There are many ways to make money in Africa. But if you're going to invest in Africa, you need first of all to learn something about it. And then you need to find other people, possibly the institution of the World Bank and the African Development Bank, that could work with sovereign wealth funds to look for ways in which investments could be created on that continent. I'm saying this because I know very well from my past experience that sovereign wealth funds, by and large, have not looked at Africa. In fact, if you look at the investments in this last year, I believe there is one for 100 million that has been made by a sovereign wealth fund in Africa. But the point is that you're here at a time when you're considering the policy and strategy. And during the course of the day, Africa has not been mentioned. I really urge you to think of it, because you can't ignore it. As Al will tell you tomorrow, you can't ignore it in environmental terms. And you also can't ignore it in terms of economic and human terms. And sovereign wealth funds can and should learn something about Africa. And it may not be necessary that every sovereign wealth fund has a research department that deals with Africa. In fact, it may well be that meetings such as this might encourage a few of you to get together, to have a study group that could work with some people that know about Africa, to at least take a look at it, to try and come together and see if there is something there that can be done. Because a lot of money has been made in Africa. And what has been suggested by my successor was, let's take 1%, 40 billion. And it'll grow by 2012, it'll be 60 billion. But think about a continent not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of self-interest and as a matter of economic opportunity. You cannot forget 2 billion people. You cannot forget a continent the size of Africa. And you cannot pretend that economic opportunity is limited only to those places you want to go. I urge you very much, if I have one thing to say at the end of a very long day, that you might give some thought to that simple thought and maybe follow it up so that at the next meeting of this group, someone can talk about Africa, and maybe a few of you could have looked at it and tried to see constructively whether together with others you can contribute to a better life for 2 billion people that will be there by 2050. Thank you very much.
One of the very last few speeches of tonight, don't worry, and it will be short. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Mr. Bertrand Badré, Chief Financial Officer of the Crédit Agricole Group, which is a sponsor of the Sovereign Wealth Fund Research Initiative. And Bertrand has been very supportive of our project from the beginning, and we are very grateful to him. If I may say something personal, Bertrand joined Crédit Agricole from Lazare in July 2007. He wanted to spend more time with his family, but it was just before the beginning of the market turmoil, so bad personal timing. But the first time we met was at a closing dinner celebrating a sale by Crédit Agricole of a large equity stake in a financial stock, August 2008, so just before the September crash. Good professional timing. Now, more seriously, before that, Bertrand has had an extensive experience both in the private and in the public sectors. The topics of the conference reflect his career, which is at the intersection of finance and public policy. He has been a member of the French presidency diplomatic team and an organizer of the Avian G8 summit, which focused notably on clean energy and climate change issues. He is also the author of several books, along with the former managing director of the IMF, Michel Camdessus. The title of one of them is O, or Water, And the main message of this book echoes our conference and also Mr. Wolfensohn's speech. Let me quote just one sentence, and it's my own translation, so I apologize. There is one goal that poor and rich will attain together, a sustainable growth, which is the mainstay of a sustainable development. Our only certainty about water and its rarity is that due to the importance of the challenge, nobody will get out of it alone. Bertrand, the floor is yours.
I will just reassure you, it's been a very long day for me, probably even more than for you, because you woke up at 8:30 this morning, New York time. I woke up at 5 this morning, Paris time. And it's been that's why I will, this will protect you from a long speech. But it's been a very interesting day from all perspectives, and I was very happy to hear Jim Wolfensohn again, because as I reminded him, I met with him 7 years ago, and we discussed exactly along the same lines the importance of Africa for all of us. So this day has been a long day. I woke up at 5 a.m., not to join you, but first of all to bring my son to a bus, which was departing with his school to Verdun. I don't know, for the non-French or non-German people, Verdun has been probably the site of the bloodiest battle in Europe. More than 1.5 million people died there in 1916. So if you think about long-term perspective, you have to put this in perspective, and fortunately Europe has changed. So my day started a bit early, but with already long-term perspective. Then I went to Crédit Agricole headquarters in Paris, where we had a discussion on our 10-year plan. There are not that many companies in the world that can seriously, without laughing, discuss about 10-year perspective. Maybe the World Bank is another example. And so, last but certainly not least, I'm very happy to be here tonight to discuss, not to discuss, again, I'm going to be brief, but to mention with you the long-term perspective and the role that together we have tonight. So why did Crédit Agricole choose to sponsor these initiatives along with the two academic world in France and here in Colombia? I think it makes a lot of sense. First of all, because long-term is part of our history, is part of our DNA, our genes. Crédit Agricole was funded in the late 19th century, more or less like Grameen Bank. Few farmers in the east of France at the Swiss border put together their money to buy a cow. And here we are, 125 years later, one of the biggest banks in the world. So fortunately, these guys thought long-term and have been able to accumulate cash year in, year out for 125 years. And that's why we can seriously discuss about the next 10 years or next 20 years, next 50 years. As I've been often asked throughout the crisis, do you think you might die someday? I say, well, probably. I mean, we are all mortal, so we might die someday. But the day we go to the cemetery, it's going to be too late because the cemetery will be full. So we have survived so far. I'm quite confident we might survive for another period, a long period. And why am I so confident? It's because of our structure, not only our history. Our structure is very peculiar. And there are not that many banks in the world that are made this way. We are structured along 39 regional banks, which are mutual entity. And this was something very interesting, if I may remember this, in New York. Last year, after the G20 in London, Mr. Geithner, the Treasury Secretary here, circulated a white paper where basically you could read that the only form of legitimate banking was a joint stock company. And we had to fight to make sure that there were different forms of banking world, the way there are different forms of capitalism. And that's why we are very happy to discuss tonight a new form of capitalism. And I think there are many forms. And being a hybrid company with a mutual foot and being listed as well, I think we are particularly well equipped to discuss these issues with you. And if I may say, our 39 regional banks, they don't like it. But I often compare them with sovereign funds. The reality is that there are like 39 regional wealth funds sponsoring a bank which is working in the interest of the French economy, of the European economy, and sometimes of the world economy. I don't know if there are people from Singapore here. Yes. Hello. I'm always saying that you know, the beauty of Crédit Agricole is that we are making a link or a bridge between Saint-Flour. I'm pretty sure nobody knows where Saint-Flour is. Saint-Flour is really at the heart of France, in Auvergne. Auvergne is the richest, not the richest, but like Scotland, you know, a place where people are not supposed to spend their money. It's a place where they... So we have an excess of money in Auvergne. So from Saint-Flour to Singapore, so this is really what we have in mind. It's very important to have this feeling of long-term, of building for our descendants, and we have what we have inherited from our ancestors. So that's really something important for Crédit Agricole. We are very happy, along with Amundi and Crédit Agricole CIB, to sponsor this event. All the more, as I think this is important that we have this discussion now. There have been many international meetings, starting from the G8, as you mentioned, now G7, G8, G20, G whatever. Actually, I discovered that G20 was probably more G30 in reality. I don't know how many we are tonight, but I think it's an important milestone that we are able to discuss these important issues and to discuss this with different views than the just traditional mainstream view. And as a conclusion, maybe, I would say, and we discussed that briefly with Mr. Stiglitz, my neighbor, in the US, you know that cities are pretty simple. On the one hand, you have Wall Street, on the other hand, you have Main Street. Let's decide today that we have another avenue, which is a pretty interesting avenue, I think. Let's call it Sovereign Street. And I think we have a lot to build around this to make sure that there are different forms of capitalism and that we have something to add to this kind of binary Wall Street, Main Street vision. And last, maybe not least, just a few comments. It's just on my memory. This was something which was discussed by I think the I'm tired. What do you say? Ecumenical, Council of Churches, I'm looking far away. But in Australia, Mr. Wolfensohn, in Canberra in 1987, there was a discussion about development and growth. And I really found this difference very interesting. On the one hand, they say growth, is like the strategy of cancer. It's just proliferation without any limits. They just live on the body and they kill the body. Whereas development is like the embryo. You have to build piece after piece in the right time and make sure this gives something. And I think we really have to make the difference, and that's our collective responsibility tonight, to make a difference between growth, which is fascinating but dangerous, and development. And you mentioned it also encompasses the African situation. Thank you very much for your attention, and now it's time for having a good night.